welcome to today's webinar. My name is Justine Chappell, if you don't already know me, and I am the Communications and Marketing Manager for CaFÉ. Today I'm going to be going over what you should know about collecting and storing applicant data. Data collection and privacy is an important topic these days, so I'm going to be sharing some relevant information, relevant meaning how it pertains to your use of CaFÉ, about collecting personal information and some general internet safety tips. The disclaimer I'll share is that I'm not a data expert, but I've compiled this set of tips from my teammates' experience working with CaFÉ and complying to the data standards that we have. Also, we do have a blog post written last year on the topic. It's in our blog if you go to our website, and this kind of goes over a lot of what we'll be talking about today as well, if you want to use that as a reference. The main key items that we'll cover today include securely collecting information from applicants, ensuring data accuracy, safely storing applicant information, and preventing common internet threats. So let's talk about defining data collection. So for the purpose of this webinar and in the context of running an art call on CaFÉ, we're talking about data collection as the process of gathering personal information for use in decision-making, business transactions, or in the execution of an event, project, or whatever it is that you're running on CaFÉ. Personal information in this case includes contact information, possibly demographic information, business info, and or payment information. So this does not encompass all of what data collection is, but this is the kind that I'll be referring to today. So let's start with the beginning of the art call process right now, which would be when you're setting up your call in CaFÉ and opening the application to applicants. So we'll start by saying that CaFÉ does already do the heavy lifting in terms of collecting and storing basic personal and contact information. So this here is a list of the information that's already collected by CaFÉ. You should be pretty familiar with this. So we collect the first and last name, business or studio name, which is optional, the artist's address, city, state, and zip code, phone number, email address, website, which is also optional. And then it's also optional for them to include any team or partner information. And just to show you on the CaFÉ side, this is the artist sign up registration form. And so this is just showing that we already collect this information. And now all this info will be, provided to you in the form of reports, as well as on the application itself. Artist's info gets pulled in automatically, so you don't have to ask for that kind of information on the application form. So we'll touch on how this information is securely stored, which kind of relates to how our databases are accessed by organizations and internal staff. But because we collect this information, that means that you don't really have to worry about. So all of this info can be updated at any time by an artist in their profile. So it will update across all of their applications that they've submitted. So you don't have to worry about making sure contact info is updated or making sure that the artist updates their address, the email, that will already be saved in the applications that you receive on CaFÉ. So what about the additional information that you need to get from artists? This you can collect by building application questions, but you'll need to consider a few things before you start asking anything and everything about them. A lot of this is common sense, but we have some guidelines about things to consider before asking for someone's information. So first is to start with intent. So be as transparent as possible about how it will be used, who will see the information and have access to it, and how it will inform decisions. So some questions that you can consider are you planning to act on the results that you receive? For example, will you use this information the applicant is giving you to make a decision about who is eligible, about maybe who is selected in the jury? Another question is, do you already know what the findings would tell you? If you do, then you might not need to collect that info. Do you need to collect this information right now, or could you collect it from a smaller set of individuals later on? Maybe it's some information that you only need from selected participants. If it's easy enough to get that information later on, then you might as well do it then and not in the out front. And then finally, if this data were to fall in the hands of an individual who could do the most harm with it, what would happen? So that kind of gives you some basic guidelines of when you start to ask questions, considering what could possibly be what it could be used for and what could happen if it fell into the wrong hands. And just to show you a little bit, talking about transparency and how you let applicants know your intent, we'll go into CaFÉ real quick and I'll show you. Let's open up a call and I'll go to the call editor. We suggest outlining the information that you'll be asking of applicants in your call listing detail. So this is the event information tab of the call editor. And specifically the application requirements is where you can outline this. So not only should you list what artists will need to prepare, such as, images, statements, whatever it is you're collecting from them, it's also not a bad idea to list what other information you'll need. So depending on the opportunity, maybe you need project budgets, maybe you need income levels, maybe you need demographic information to determine eligibility, which we'll touch on demographics later on. But make sure you list out all that information up front so that artists have your intent when they get to those questions on the application and can make an informed decision on their consent to give this info. Which brings me to the second guideline we have, which is consent. So getting informed consent from respondents where possible. This one is kind of built into CaFÉ already, which is another likely, unseen perk of using CaFÉ. But not only do artists have to agree to our terms of use for using the site and registering for an account, they also have to agree to your terms and conditions to apply. So back to the call listing details, we do have that rules and terms to apply section where you'll need to outline your legal agreement about how collected information, and it can include about how collected information is being used by your organization. So you'll include anything that you have here. And we do recommend, including anything if you are collecting certain information to say how that will be used or how their images might be used, things like that. Another thing you should consider when collecting data is confidentiality and anonymization. So for data to be anonymous, that means it's impossible for someone to connect the data back to the original individual. And then for something to be confidential, that means someone could connect the data back to the original individual, but chooses not to do so. So consider from your perspective as an administrator, because you'll have access to all of the information that an artist provides, every application answer is tied to their artist info, meaning the information that you collect and you see will be considered confidential. But let's consider from your juror's perspective. Some of this information may be anonymized. For example, a blind jury where you're hiding an artist's name or any other information. So think about what information that you'll need to know or that you'll automatically be knowing versus what the jurors need to know and maybe what they don't need to know. Is there any information that you can go ahead and hide from an application for the sake of keeping that anonymized from the juror? The next thing that we have to talk about today is the demographic data, and I have some do's and don'ts for demographic data. And so, for the purpose of this webinar and using CaFÉ, demographic data refers to any information about a person, whether that be gender, age, income level, ethnicity. Some of this data is being collected by organizations on a regular basis so they can understand their user base or their audience. And it's not always relevant to a call in CaFÉ, but we do get opportunities where, maybe someone's ethnicity is pertaining to their eligibility to apply, or maybe their income level pertains to an eligibility to apply. So some of these things are relevant. So let's go through some do's and don'ts. The first thing we have here is to explain why you are collecting such information. If you are asking for someone's income level, that's fine, but tell them why so that they know what it's being used for. If you're asking if it's related to whether or not they're eligible, explain that to them so that they're aware of why they're providing this information. So you'll want to express the reasons why this demographic data is important to your organization or call. And then don't ask questions that don't align with your goals. Consider how the information will be used. Ask yourself why you are asking for demographic data and what you will do with it internally and externally, if that's the case. If this information will not actually be acted upon, don't ask for it. It's pretty simple. You don't want to just collect data about people for the sake of maybe looking at it once and not really doing anything with it, holding it, and maybe feeling like you'll access it later. But if you don't have a specific plan for why you're asking for the information, then you don't need to ask for it. And then make sure you do add an other or prefer not to say option to questions, and make sure that the question is optional to answer. This might play into, eligibility, and you can decide what might actually be required. But for most demographic info, if you're using it for informational purposes, you do want to give the option to opt out, or at least have an artist provide an additional piece of information if any of the answer options don't apply to them. So what I'm going to do is actually show you how to build an other answer option for any questions that you might have. And this will kind of give you a tutorial on the conditional logic process or option in the application builder. So if I go to the application editor in CaFÉ, this is where you build out any of your application questions right here under custom form questions. And I'm just going to show you about how to ask for some information that allows someone to select an other option. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to build a base question. That's going to be the question I'm asking. This one's going to be with a checkbox question type. And let's just ask about someone's gender. And so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this required toggle off because I don't want this to be required for everyone. And I'm going to say, what is your gender? And we'll add the, normal answer options and make sure we're including, additional options for non-binary folks. We can also be very detailed and include a lot of other gender identities that exist in the world. But for this sake, I'm going to keep it simple. And I'm going to add just one additional other answer option. And that's all I'm going to do for this step. I'm just going to build that question and click create. You'll see it got added here. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to build that additional question if someone were to choose other. So I'll click build new question again. This one will be a text box so the folks can insert the additional text that they have for their answer. So this one's going to be gender other. There's going to be no limit. It's not going to be required. And I'm just going to put, you'll see how this looks later, but just put other here. Then I'm going to enable conditional logic. We already have this set up. Show if this question, if any of the following match, we're going to add a rule and then select this question. We're going to select our gender question we just created and then say is other. So this is basically saying here, I want to show this question about, entering an other answer if the gender question is answered other. We have more information about conditional logic in our help center and in previous webinars that you can check out if you want to learn more about using conditional logic for your applications. And then I'll click create question and you'll see it gets added to the bottom. I'm going to make sure that even if I update these order of questions at any point, I'm going to keep those together. Then I'm going to preview the call real quick so you can see what this looks like. We have any of our application questions here. This is the one we just created, and you'll see I can choose any of the answer options. But if I were to choose the other option, I now am presented with this other question box. So that's how you build using conditional logic, an other answer option. And again, just be sure that demographic data, if you don't have it required for eligibility, that it's not required, that someone would be able to answer it with an additional answer, or you could even include another one that says prefer not to say, and that's definitely recommended as well. All right. The next tip we have is to not ask too many questions. So especially when collecting demographic information, it's important not to ask too many questions because that causes survey fatigue and may result in respondents inaccurately answering questions. So if you have a lot of questions and if you're asking for a lot of information, not only would someone get confused or wonder why you're asking for so much demographic info, but they might get fatigued and not want to properly answer identifying information about themselves. And then finally, we have don't offer incomplete, inaccurate, or offensive checkbox options. So it's important to note that the methods for collecting demographic data can often change as more inclusive and accessible practices are put into place. So while gathering this information may be important for your organization, research, whatever use you have for it, make sure to revisit your methods to ensure you're staying up to date with what is recommended. And that just, means maybe as you're building your next year's call, doing some research on, what is currently the accepted answer options for race or ethnicity or disability types or anything like that. Again, I know some of this stuff might not apply to everyone, but it's important to know if you are collecting demographic data. All right, so the next topic we have today is about collecting payment information. So we've got some, information here that I'll just kind of go over. In CaFÉ, we use an outside payment processor to securely collect, store, and use payment info for transactions. Administrators, including CaFÉ staff, only has access to transaction information and basic identifying info for what payment method is used, but we don't see any complete details of the artist's payment info. Artists can save payment info in CaFÉ, but information is encrypted when stored, and again, all saved with our third-party payment processor. Artists can also remove, add, edit, or edit payment methods in their account profile, and their password is required an additional time to allow them to do this. So just to demonstrate real quickly, if I were to log in here with my artist account, with my username and password, if I go to my profile, this is stuff where I can update my information, but then we now have a saved payment section where I can come in here, and if I have purchased something in the past, my credit card information can get saved here, but if I want to delete it from my profile, I can come here and do that. And I can also add a method or edit a method if I want it to be updated for my next payment. So if artists reach out to you for help and they are having, they need assistance with payment, don't let them give you payment information over the phone, especially email. And if they need help, they can contact our support team for assistance. We're available during business hours and we can help with payments. If you collect check payments, be sure to have an organized method for setting up to receive those checks, and be sure to add that information in CaFÉ for better organization and proof of purchase. So what I'm talking about here is if you accept check payments, which you can do on the product editor, you can make sure it's either set to all or just check. But if you do accept checks, make sure in the event management page, when you get to kind of organizing folks' entries, I'm just going to open this batch of invited folks. Their transaction details will be listed, and if they pay by check, it will actually look like, oops, we don't have one here. Not invited. Let's see. There we go. So this folk paid by check, and when you are first getting the check, or when you first receive the application in CaFÉ, it will actually be set to it'll be set to pending because it's pending your receipt of that check. But when you receive the check, you can come in here and change it to received. Maybe you have to change it not received if you never got it, or returned. And the artist would have already put in the check number that they wrote the check for. So make sure you come in here and update that, because that will make sure that any income breakdown reports you run with the transaction information will be updated, and will calculate that check payment as received versus pending. And it will also make it so that you have better organization throughout CaFÉ, and you can track when checks are received so that you don't risk checks getting lost or anything like that. CaFÉ can help you organize which ones are received and which ones are not. So that's kind of a little bit about payment information and using CaFÉ. Next, we're going to talk about ensuring data accuracy and building easy-to-use forms. So it's important to build easy-to-use forms, and we've already touched on this subject a little bit already. But building easy-to-use forms ensures that a respondent or an applicant will be able to fill out the information correctly and without any problems that may lead to data inaccuracy. So again, in the application editor, just the additional tip I have here is to make sure you do use the correct question type for the information that you'll be collecting. So if you need a specific answer from a small range of possible options, make sure you use that checkbox or the radio button list, and that allows for clear data to be received. For example, we have a question here that's, how did you hear about the call? And if I go to the application preview, I need to log out now. If I go to the application preview, you'll see here we have that. How did you hear about this call? And I've given a list of answers in a drop-down method. And that allows for the artist to have to choose one so that when I receive the information and I pull a report of the answers, I can clearly see how many people chose the different answer options. I also did build another question or another answer option if someone wanted to say it further. But if I were to give a text box as the original type for this question, it's requiring artists not only to have to spend energy typing out how they heard about this call, but it just makes it easier for them to select the answer that pertains to them. And it allows me to not have to go through the answers and categorize someone's answer to say, oh, okay, it was social media, or, oh, I see it's word of mouth. I can just clearly go ahead and see what they searched or what they used to get to this call. And that's just kind of some basic best practices for collecting data that gives you a clear answer. So that's a little bit about ensuring data accuracy and making sure you build application forms that are easy to use. Next, I want to talk about safely storing applicant information. It's even more important than collecting data, which is to store data securely. CaFÉ does help you collect and store information because we are an online database that is protected, but it also helps you to keep up to date on this information and keep it responsibly held. So let's start with some responsible practices for accessing and using CaFÉ. The information stored on CaFÉ is compliant with current privacy standards, which includes limiting the access to authorized individuals only. So obviously, CaFÉ staff has access to CaFÉ, but only staff members that need access to it for business operations is granted access to CaFÉ. Additionally, organizations, you all, must have a signed up-to-date contract in order to access CaFÉ. And then obviously only information that pertains to your specific calls in your organization do you have access to. So we don't just give access about every artist to any organization. It's only for the organizations that have those calls. And you only see the applicant information for the applicants that apply to your calls. And then we do have a maximum 5 administrator accounts allowed per organization. And we do that so that we can, limit that access and that you're not just building up who has access to the information, especially when there might be staff transitions. If you didn't know that we can have up to 5 accounts, you might want to add some other folks to your organization's account on CaFÉ. That's fine. You can just contact us and we can add usernames and passwords for up to 5 administrators. We do highly discourage the sharing of administrator accounts. If you were to share username and passwords, that makes it tricky to be able to know who logged in, who's accessing the information, and sharing passwords and things like that gets pretty tricky when it comes to really making sure that you have a secure account. We can also deactivate accounts for administrators. So if you have someone who leaves your organization or someone who's not working on CaFÉ currently, let us know and we'll deactivate accounts. We don't yet have the ability to limit administrator access. For example, having administrators who only have access to certain calls or only has access to certain information, but that's something that we have in our backlog of things to update and make it a little bit more easy for you to limit access. But for now, if you want, we can always add an administrator for a specific call, let them have access for the time that is needed, and then we can always go in and deactivate so that they don't have access anymore. And then, of course, we also let you determine access for jurors. And jurors must be granted access by that specific organization to be able to jury a specific call. And because you're able to do that, I can go in here and show you what that looks like. In the jury tab, we'll go to jurors. So you have control over your list of jurors and who is active, and then you can also deactivate people. So when you're ready to add jurors, you can add them there, set up their username and password. You can also take existing jurors and remove them from access of certain calls or give them access to other calls and change it up that way. And you also control when the jury portal is open to be able to be given that jurors, access to that information. Of course, jurors only have access to the jury side of CaFÉ, which only includes information about specific entries and artwork. And you can also set up specific permissions by going to the jury administration portal. And in the setup section, you can mark which information you want to hide. So again, you can set up a blind jury by activating the blind jury. You can check mark any of these items to hide them from the juror. So make sure you're only checking the ones you want to hide. For example, demographic information might not be relevant to jurors, so you might want to hide that information from them. And click Save to save all that. As you're working with jurors, you can make sure that they are given access, and obviously they're only given access as well if the jury process is in progress. Another thing you can do to ensure that your account is secure is use multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication adds another layer of security to your administrator account and your juror accounts. And all CaFÉ staff actually is required to use multi-factor authentication, but it is an option for administrators and jurors. To show you this, I'm going to go ahead and log out. So when I log in as an administrator or a juror, I'm going to select my username I'm using today. And this is my first step to authenticate my account, and that is entering a username and the correct password. When I log in, I'm then taken to my second step, which is why it's called multi-factor authentication. I'm doing a second additional step for authenticating my account. In this case, I have an app set up where it's going to give me a code that I'll enter in here. So I'm just going to look at my app and I'm going to enter the code I'm given. If I'm using this device often, I can actually go in and click Remember this device, and that will mean that my browser will remember that I'm authenticated, that I'm trustworthy, so it won't actually ask me for this code. It'll only ask me for that code every 90 days. But just remember, if you have multiple CaFÉ accounts, such as one administrator account, one juror account, you can only really remember one account per device, so choose the one that you use most often. My code is actually changed up on my app since I've been talking, so I'll go ahead and do that. And there we go. Now I can be logged in. So we do really recommend using this. You can set it up so that you receive the code via email or an authenticator app. So if you go to this top little level icon here and click on profile, it takes you to this page in which you'll see that you can either set up email to receive your code. We did just update the email settings so that you should hopefully receive your email faster. I know that some folks are waiting a little while to receive their code, but you'll receive it faster now. Or you can use an app, which means if you download an app on your phone or your computer, it will always have a code available to you, and all you have to do is look at it and put in the code. So there's no waiting required. You can also disable it. And like I said, we do recommend having multi-factor authentication for your account just to ensure that highest level of security. And finally, this also plays into why we recommend not sharing administrator accounts throughout your organization, because you're not going to be able to give a code. You can only have one method set up for receiving a code. And so unless you have a shared email, which is another thing, you won't be able to set up MFA for a shared administrator account. And just some other, best practices. Don't share passwords with fellow administrators or jurors, especially via email. For jurors, yes, you will set up a username and a password, and you can share that password with them in person or over the phone if you really must. But the easiest and most secure way is to let them set their own password. So to do that, we can help them, instruct them to do this, or they can figure it out, or you can tell them. Again, let me log out. If they go to the login site, which every juror logs in on admin.callforentry.org, if they have their username, but they don't have a password yet, they can just come to Forgot Password, enter their email address, enter their username, and click Reset Password. And as long as their username account was created, they'll receive an email with a link to set up a new password. And so that's how they can not only set up a password if they've forgotten it, but they can set up their first password if they haven't yet logged into CaFÉ. All right. So next we have, talking about reports. So, let me log in again. So with downloading reports, which you have available, you can go to Events Management. You can access information and download spreadsheets of content information, application answers, media information. You can download PDFs as well. You can also download income breakdown reports, which again, it will have transaction information. It doesn't have payment information, but using reports and ensuring data safety is kind of where it gets a little bit tricky. But just follow some basic guidelines for being responsible about how you handle reports. So of course you can download this information, but we recommend only storing these reports on private computers or servers that only you have access to. Don't share files via email when possible. Use secure file transfer tools. And this more pertains to contact information, just so that, folks with malicious intent don't access those reports and have lists to that contact information. So use things like WeTransfer or Dropbox to share files amongst your team. Also, be sure you organize those handle files so you don't get it all mixed up. Don't share reports with anyone outside of your organization. And if you do have to do that, you can use a terms of use agreement that stipulates proper handling of the information. And then also just, have a plan for how long you plan to store information before archiving or removing it. CaFÉ will store all the information for you. So if you need to access a report for a limited time, you can use it and then dispose of it properly by putting it into your trash bin on your computer and then deleting the trash. Like I said, because CaFÉ does store this information, you can kind of keep it all in CaFÉ. And as long as you have a current contract with us, you'll have access to all the past and current information about applicants in your database on CaFÉ. So that's just a little bit about using reports and making sure that you keep those that information safe. As technology advances, so does the technology of scammers and those who try to take advantage of you and your information. So this is not really directly related to CaFÉ, but it's always good to keep an eye out for phishing attempts and other scams. This might include things that, maybe has CaFÉ's name on it or from an artist that you have been communicating with. And we'll talk a little bit about what phishing attempts look like, and we'll do that now. But phishing is the fraudulent practice of sending emails or other messages seeming to be from a reputable company or person in order to get you to reveal personal information, such as passwords, credit card information, or anything else that's sensitive information. So like I said, some accounts might get hacked and you might receive an email that looks like it's from an artist that had applied to a previous call, but it might not actually be from them. It might also not be a hacked account. It's just someone sending you an email that looks like it's from someone that you know, when in fact it's not. So signs of phishing attempts are, and this is just a short list, there's other things as well, and I'm not going to try to get too much into this topic, but just some basic things. Some basic signs are that the message that you receive uses subdomains or misspelled URLs, or otherwise suspicious URLs. The message that you receive might be written to invoke fear or a sense of urgency. Could be something saying like, I need your info now, or like, your access to this specific account is going to be deactivated unless you give me this information, something like that. The message might also include a request to verify personal information, such as financial details or a password. And then maybe the message is poorly written or has spelling or grammatical errors. So any of these signs might be an indicator that the email you're receiving might be a phishing attempt. And by the way, it can also not just be email. It can be over the phone. It can be text messages. They're getting really good these days. So be on the lookout. And if anything like this raises a flag for you, when in doubt, report the email. And there's some things you can do as well to avoid and prevent being scammed. So strategies to avoid and prevent it include slowing down when receiving emails and reading them, especially ones that you didn't expect to receive. Check the email address of the sender for anything wrong or misspelled. That will kind of raise suspicion for you. And then if it is a known sender, but the message itself seems suspicious, follow up with that person separately using a different contact method to make sure that they did or did not send the email. And if they did not send the email, that would give you an idea, obviously, that it didn't come from them. And then just in general, never give private or financial information via phone or email. If it's something that you do need to disclose, there are certain ways to ensure that you're speaking to the right person and that you've initiated this process of information and that it's not something that's randomly requested from you. So that's just a little bit about phishing attempts. It's something that we like to keep an eye out for, and we encourage you to keep an eye out for, and just kind of relates to general internet data and privacy information. So getting to a question I do see in the chat, can a call include the requirement that the work be made within a certain time period, say 3 years, and not allow the application to be entered if the artist doesn't answer? Yes and no. So yes, you can definitely have a requirement that the work must be made within a certain time period. That's standard for some folks. In terms of making it so that the application cannot be entered, I will say that CaFÉ cannot look at the artwork year. You know how an artist would put the year when the artwork was created. CaFÉ doesn't have something where it looks at that year and says, oh, it's ineligible, you can't apply. You can build in an application question, though, where if you can create your own kind of barrier where you're building a question. Maybe it's a radio button that only has one, and you say artwork year. I'm not going to type out the whole question, but it might be something that includes something like that, and you have the answer option like yes, it's made in the year. Something like that, and you don't provide any other answer option. You just provide this, and if I can't answer no to that question, I must not be eligible. It could also be something more simple as just providing an informational only question that just gives some text on the application itself that just boldly says you are not able to submit this application if your artwork has not been created in the last 3 years. So while you can't explicitly qualify certain artwork to be eligible, you can build in these things that gets artists to pay attention to whether or not that their artwork can be submitted. All right, and then I have another question. How do you ask for income politely for discounted entry if need be? You just have to be honest. If that's the reason why you're asking for income, you can say that qualified applicants might be available for a discounted entry or might be eligible for discounted entry, and ask them to specify their income level using ranges. And you can also tell them that that information will be only accessed by the organization and not used for any other purpose. You can also stipulate that we only have a limited number of discounted entry fees available, so please do not give an income that does not match what you're given. So again, you would just build a question that asks for that information, but include that additional context. So this concludes our webinar of what you should know about collecting and storing applicant data. I hope you learned something new or at least gained some better insight into the importance of being careful with applicant data. Thanks again for joining our webinar today, and be sure to join our next webinar next month.